All right. Take 4. Here we go. It's been a couple now. Been working on this project for a little bit, haven't I? All right. So, hello. My name is Ranger Savage. Some of you may know me as that once in a while streamer on twitch.tv, or as the guy who plays Linux in Ascension Academy roleplay, or as a friend, or maybe you don't know me at all. I'm a member of the VRChat role-playing community, and I have been for about 5 years now, and I've seen a lot go on over the years. Today, I wanted to talk to you about some of the accusations going through the community. If you've been keeping up, I'm firmly of the belief that foul play was involved, that a lack of apology is incredibly telling of all intent, and that I've been kind of exasperated at the lack of education on some particular subjects. I've decided then that today I'm going to make a brief presentation that hits on 3 points I feel have been mentioned a bit, but not really expanded upon to my liking. Over the course of this presentation, I'm going to be explaining and defining consent and sexual harassment, expanding on their context, and then showing you specific cases that help people understand the wheres and whys of Mr. Brunswick's conduct being called out in relation to them. For people who already know these sorts of things, there will still be some value for you. At the end of the video, I'll be listing a number of RPs that have decided to harbor people who engage in this sort of behavior. So for people concerned for their safety going into this wonderful hobby, you'll want to hear that too. There will also be a short point at the end on why applying legal precedent to the situation sort of ignores the actual issues at hand. I'd like to disclaimer beforehand, I'm not here to do an analysis front to back of the entire situation. My scope is limited to what I want to talk about. If I don't touch on a subject, it's because I'm not speaking as an expert opinion. I'm just giving you my outlook, defining things as I understand them, and hopefully giving worthwhile input on the situation. In one of the ways that I know how to. For any eagle eyes out there, I've been professionally trained on how to handle workplace harassment, and I hold a certification in regard to that in my home country. For the sake of my own privacy, I won't share anything more than that. But again, I am not an expert. I do have a background, at least in my country, that makes me confident enough to speak on some of this. So we will begin immediately, right into the first slide. So let me just do this. There we go. Consent. We start with it. As you can see, I've pulled up the Oxford definition. It reads a simple voluntary agreement. And is what consent is. It's a voluntary agreement. Cool, right? Seems simple. Well, in the context of sexual conduct, the definition generally complexifies depending on jurisdiction, but retains a number of fairly consistent principles in English common law. So if we go over here, here's a couple of those principles. Hey, how about that? Keep in mind that this is not legal advice, and you should research more on your own if you want to apply this information. We will start at the top, at the left. Consent is informed, which means broadly that the person must understand what they're consenting to. They can't say they're all right with some bedroom fun and then have their partner bring in other aspects or activities to that said bedroom activity. An example would be consenting to some cuddling and touching, and then the other person doing more than just cuddling and touching. Okay? Number 2, it must be freely given and coherent. As in, it must be a clear yes, and it must be given free of pressure. It can be taken away at any time. It must be given while the person is sober. And it must be comfortable and based on equal power. We'll be touching on those last two a little bit later, but not necessarily on this screen. Now, what is not consent? You probably have some obvious examples in your head, but it's a little bit more complex than just that. It isn't flirting, so consent is not flirting. Consent is not silence. It is not the absence of a no. Okay? So those are pretty simple. Those are simple so far for everybody. Consent is not consent if it takes convincing. Now, what does that mean exactly? It means that if you ask once, get a no, ask again, get a yes, it's still a no. You can't persuade someone into it if they don't want it. Now, for the next three here, you'll want to pay extra attention. They are the most relevant to our discussion today. So, of the first, consent cannot be pressured. You can't be pressured to say yes or be too afraid to say no, otherwise known as under duress. In the most extreme example, you can imagine somebody putting a gun to your head. In a more insidious example, you can imagine sly threats delivered in subtext. The next one is consent cannot be given as a result of abuse of trust, power, or position. Now, what does that mean exactly? More specifically, in common English, understanding this generally means that you cannot consent to sexual activity with someone who has significant power over you. Most common examples of this would be your professor in university, or your boss at work, or someone who has implicit trust and position over you. Of course, at the bottom here, the easiest of the three, you can't consent to something if you're knocked out or under the influence because it impairs your judgment. Now, onto the specifics of what's happening in the community lately. I'm going to be showing some DMs, uncensored, on screen in a couple moments. Some viewers may find this content distressing, so move forward at your own risk. Okay? All right. So we will go into it. Boom. I'm going to be moving over here for ease of reading on this side. When the video is fully rendered on YouTube, it will be 1080, 60 FPS. So you shouldn't have a problem reading this. But for the sake of people who are on mobile or people who are just listening, I will be reading out a couple of the quotes. In this example, the streamer Mr Brunswick uses a certain word to describe what they'll be doing to somebody. The other individual then types out and sends the following: "Love it." Quote, "Love it, but let's change or lose the R word, heart emoji," unquote. In this instance, they have specifically expressed their desire to not use that word. Now, we can see here there's a couple things going on, but to stay on point of the slide, I'll simply speak to what they say up here on the second screenshot, where I'm standing. "I will do all of this whether or not you want me to," quote. All right? "You know that. Spit it out." Spit it out being in reference to the word itself. You can see the DMs continue, that Brunswick sort of continues to try and convince them to allow the use of that word. Does anybody remember the last slide where it said consent cannot be convinced and that it must be free from pressure? In this example, Brunswick has ignored their initial desire and tried to pull their teeth to use that word. At the end of this DM on screen, they explain that they'll, quote, manipulate you into accepting it and quote, "I promise I will destroy you." And for anybody who's going to bring up that there was consent before and after the fact, we'll go into that when we hit sexual harassment. But it is worth noting that the last slide also said that consent must be ongoing. That means in this context that when they said no, they said no. It doesn't matter what happened before or after. So we have pressure, we have convincing, and this would be an example of no consent and continuing to try and weasel into it, as well as an admission to manipulation thereof, all wrapped up neatly in the pretext of flirting and being kinky. I'll give you a hint though, pressuring and convincing consent is still wrong even if you think it's kinky. Nobody here is explicitly in character quotes, all right? It's not a fantasy. It's what they typed and sent. Now, we'll go to the next slide. For the sake of my sanity, I'm not going to stick on too many slides for too much longer than I have to. I hope you understand. The next slide doesn't require much. It doesn't require as many words, mostly because it's in your face about it. On our left, our intrepid hero, Mr. Brunswick, is faced with somebody saying that they aren't worth it. His response, quote, "I love your suffering," unquote, etc., etc. He just, keeps going until he gets to the interesting bit. Quote, "Why do you think I'm the only one to give you a main role in anything? Question mark, unquote." Okay, so now to those of you in the back, does that sound odd? Does it sound in character to you, perhaps? It's directly referencing Brunswick taking this person under their wing in their RP projects and giving them a fairly big role. In the following line, they even go so far as to isolate Ariana from others by saying, quote, "I know how to make you into what I want, give you some value," unquote, followed by, quote, "Everyone else is content to let you spice up their background," unquote. Now, this next bit is worse than that. It's not only an example of abusive position, it alludes to and abuses Ariana's personal struggles at the time. And in this case, weaponizes it. So let's unpack, okay? At the top, the subject of the conversation is clearly confirmed to be suicide. Brunswick instantly responds with saying they'll, quote, "coax them into it," unquote, if they waste his time. Ariana gives a negative, "Please don't," and then says it again with a, "I don't want that." Okay, so we have two negatives. And then he doubles down. He says he'd make sure they're successful, alluding to his powerful position above them again, then reconfirms that he'd be willing to coax someone vulnerable into suicide if they let him down. Ariana then gives a third denial at the bottom. For those of you who paid attention to the last slide, that's multiple instances of them alluding to this powerful position, on top of ignoring more no's. It's a breach of consent, okay? As a last thought, too, if you remember the consent slide, it also said that consent must be informed. Now, you can go through Bruns' doc as much as you like, but you won't find a point where Ariana had reasonable expectation that giving consent would include suicide themes. That means that their consent wasn't informed, okay? Now I'm going to ask, does that sound kinky to you? Okay, run that through your mind. We'll move on. So, this one is way simpler. At the top, it's stated that they're drunk. Okay, cool. You can see it. They've confirmed it. And then they make a comment that they can't say no because of it. And when I say they, I mean Brunswick. Brunswick says, "You know what? You're drunk, so you can't say no. Makes it easier for me." Now, you can draw your own conclusions. You can contextually look at it a couple ways, but most all of them aren't flattering. And you'll remember, too, you can't consent while you're under the influence. So what's the implication here? All right. Now, that's the portion for consent. We're going to be moving on to sexual harassment. I would suggest at this point that you go and get yourself a drink of water, because this is going to be a longer one. I think it's probably the longest section in the whole presentation. Whew. All right. So, sexual harassment. Some people are going to jump to saying that Brunswick's relationship with these people is not the same as that of a manager to a worker or a professor to a student. And you know what? They'd be correct. He has more power in some places and less power in others. It's not a direct correlation. But we're going to be getting into why effectively they are the same. First, though, the Merriam-Webster defines sexual harassment as uninvited and unwelcomed verbal or physical behavior of a sexual nature, especially by a person in authority towards a subordinate. Simple enough, right? I'd encourage those who wish to look more into sexual harassment and how it ties into the workplace. But for the purpose of this presentation, we'll be hammering down on why it's relevant to the ongoings with Sir Brunswick. Okay, so we're going to be keeping the scope of the video. So here's a couple behaviors that are classed as harassment. Just do that. We have unwanted touching. We have unwanted advances, discriminatory or derogatory comments, and degrading language. When applied to workplaces and workplace relationships, it can be a touch more weedy because it becomes hard for the victim to object for fear of reprisal or passing up for future promotions, the usual you can expect. In the case of Mr. Brunswick, we also touched on his degrading comments in the last couple slides, so there's no need to explain that. What we will be delving into is an existing ruling. While I don't think this specific case will apply to any law, and I have a section explicitly explaining why law doesn't matter, I feel it gives context to just how much power someone has when they are your boss. Okay. the case of Sand versus Derlick Proprietary Company Limited, and another. So, the court accepted that sexual banter was unwelcomed, even though the applicant did not directly tell the harasser that the behavior was unwanted, and despite the applicant having responded positively to some of the sexual banter. Further, it was accepted that it was difficult for the applicant to expressly resist the harasser's advances because he was her direct manager at the time. Okay? So you heard that right. Despite some of the advances being taken positively, a court of law was able to recognize that because of their relative positions, someone being harassed may not be able to object or feel able to object, and instead will lean into the treatment. Now, we're going to be going to the next slide here. Okay. So, this is going to be me making a fairly easy case that there are parallels between a community figurehead and a boss when referring to sexual harassment. I'm going to explain it right here, right now. And now you have no excuse for being dismissive about it. Okay? Okay. Firstly, it is social influence. In the sphere of the online role-playing community, it is ultimately a social activity and a hobby. People who act as big-name streamers, role-play owners, and the be-all, end-all DM of entire social circles and RPs ultimately decide who gets to participate and who has to find an entire new hobby group. Okay? So there is considerable social pressure on your hobby from somebody who has a position of power like this. There's positional influence. In the same way that they control who gets to leave or stay, community figureheads like Brunswick also control how much attention and care someone's roleplay gets. Which, in a hobby where attention from a DM makes the difference between a good session and an amazing session, most days is a very, very powerful influence. Okay? Everybody wants to have a really good time when they're in their free time and trying to enjoy it. So, the third one is the obvious monetary incentive that comes with any business. Okay? Fractured Thrones is a project. It's a business. To say it isn't would be foolish. People make their livings off of roleplay, and someone like Brunswick is the boss of Fractured Thrones. Okay? Let's say you get kicked out of Fractured Thrones, right? So what? You can just go off somewhere else. Find a new group to have fun with you, right? Well, what if that person that you pissed off and kicked you out, that big name streamer with big influence in the community, what if they already have a position in or have friends who are in positions in all of the major role plays? What if they were to run to every admin team that they know in the half dozen other role plays currently running and start telling everyone that you mustn't be trusted and aren't worth their time? What if that results in you getting blacklisted from Aether Chronicles? Okay, now you're starting to see. There's, of course, the opposite pressure. If you please them, if you say yes, if you suffer through this figurehead's unwanted advances, you get to keep all of your role-playing slots in the other RPs. You get to keep your monetary incentives. You get to keep your social circles, you know? It's a fairly simple transaction, Anyway, on to the final point. Community figureheads can use these pressures and controls to sexually harass people in the same way that a workplace boss can. Duh. For some people, roleplay is their fun. For some people, it's a job. For some, it's both. Nobody wants to get banned from the airsoft yard and every airsoft yard that the owner knows within a 50-kilometer radius. Okay? So you best hope that your community figureheads or your airsoft yard owners are aware of the influence that they hold and use it responsibly and professionally, and not to just carry out their own vendettas. All right, so we'll be moving on. I wanted to bring up an old example so that you can look at it with the new context that I've just given you. We've seen this slide before. It's like I said, I'm bringing it back just for you to see what it means and how it works. Sexual harassment, okay? Look at this again. Brunswick says it. He says, quote, "Why do you think I'm the only one who gives you a role in anything?" Quote, unquote. He says, quote, "That's only if you let me down," unquote. He says, quote, I'll make sure you were successful, unquote. Is it still sounding kinky to you with the added context? This is Brunswick, okay? He'll make you or he'll drive you to kill yourself. At least, that's how he presents himself to his victim here. He controls or influences a dozen RPs. That's his threat to Ariana, and he's done this to others in varying degrees. He convinces them he owns their success. He isolates you. He says, quote, everyone else is content to let you spice up their background, unquote. That's not in character. That's referring to a real-life situation, a real-life position that he holds over you, okay? It makes them feel like only he cares. It's heavy stuff. I know. It is. It is heavy. But I had to be plain about this. I had to put it into the context for you. I needed you to understand. All right? Now, we're going to be going into something a little bit less specific to what's actually happened, and more into what's circling the net right now. So, legality, court of public opinion, cancel culture. I think I even heard Lone Complex bring up Clown World while recording his own opinions on the matter. For anyone unaware, Clown World is a term that actually originated on 4chan. It's a critique of modern society. The problem being that critique has been associated with alt-right American ideology, including trans hate, which gives the context of the subject matter, and the victims involved, I'm not sure why he thought it was appropriate to bring up when it's used as a dog whistle for messages like transphobic hate. Perhaps he knew what he was doing, or maybe he didn't do his research for his legal analysis. Regardless of that point, though, it's not why we're on this slide. The general message from people like him is that this is a witch hunt. So let's look at what a witch hunt is really. Okay? On screen, we have two definitions. We have legalism, which is a strict conformity to the law. It's fairly simple. There's also definitions for like it being a matter of thinking in Chinese philosophy, but we're using its exact definition here as presented. Okay, and we have witch hunt, which is where I am at, which is an attempt to punish a particular group of people blamed for something based on opinion and not what they've actually done wrong, and not that they've actually done anything wrong. Excuse me. We've previously established that our primary suspect did something wrong, though, already in his previous slides, if not legally speaking, then by social norms. That's the crux of this section, really. The public critiques of Brunswick weren't intended to seek legal process. They were intended to warn others of the danger he poses, intended to get it off of their chests, to move on, ultimately to make Brunswick have to face what he did to them, how he hurt them. Make no mistake, what he did was wrong, and you can apologize all you want on his behalf, but keep in mind, he himself never apologized or said sorry. You can say, oh, well, he just messed up, but he never owned it in his doc. Go ahead, keyword search sorry and apologize in his doc. I'll be providing a Wayback Machine link in the description for you to do so yourself. You're putting words in his mouth. He hasn't said sorry yet. Not even the first step. Onward. So, back on topic. Applying legal precedent to a situation like this is, frankly, culturally tone deaf. It's evident. He's conducted himself poorly. It's been exposed, and people are rightly judging him for it. You don't need to break the law to do something wrong in the eyes of another. If you feel personally attacked, or you don't see what he did wrong, and don't want to hold him accountable to it, maybe you should be the one who's wondering why you feel that way. There's no need for a trial, because like I said, there's no desire for it. Maybe he didn't break American law. Maybe he did. It doesn't matter. Nobody's pressing charges. They're just telling people, hey, this is what he did to me. This is what he's done to others. It's not a legal dilemma. It's not a clown court. It's just people sharing experiences. To try and recontextualize it as some sort of court case is a red herring to take away from the actual critiques made against the man. Okay? All right. Whew. It's a lot of talking. Here we are. I'll be honest, I'm feeling kind of tired. My cord is not cooperating with me. And I have been working on this project for about 5 days. This is my 4th take. I wanted to do it all in one take. Here we are. So thanks for sticking around that long. We're going to finish it up for you. So, in conclusion, there's a couple that you can draw from. Other people have come to the same conclusions that I have. 1, consent etiquette wasn't followed, and in a few of the cases I showed, it was ignored outright in the moment. Boundaries were crossed, and, people were pressured in places where they shouldn't have been. 2, Brunswick acted maliciously. You can go and read some of the docs again yourself. There's points in there where he shawls his abusive and manipulative behavior behind it being kinky, behind it having consent, but we've established that it didn't. And you know what? Ultimately, he's role-playing as him fucking self. He isn't the guy from 50 Shades of Grey. It's not a defense when there's no safe word. Boundaries are crossed. Trauma is weaponized. And he's using his figurehead status in the community to apply pressure alike to workplace harassment. Okay? That's not what this is about. It's not role play. 3, Brunswick isn't being legally indicted for his behavior. He's just being judged according to his actions and to the stories of victims of his poor treatment. Trying to frame this whole thing as a legal court case is a red herring that was originally circulated in bad faith, okay? People said that because they were angry. Now, I did have a couple of side thoughts for anyone who wanted it as well. I've compiled a small list of RPs that I've been able to confirm are unsafe for vulnerable individuals as a result of Mr. Brunswick's behavior being tolerated even after all of this was made public. So, to clarify, these are places that are okay with community figureheads behaving like he did. They're willing to tolerate this behavior from their star role players. And if you're a new role player or even a season 1, being in these places is potentially dangerous, and you should be aware of that. Okay? I'm not telling you not to participate. I'm just letting you know these RPs are okay with having people who do this sort of thing in their role plays. Okay? The list is quite small. It's Actium Knights roleplay, Fractured Thrones roleplay, One Shot RP, Blackwell RP, and Aether Chronicles. All right? There you go. So, that was my aside. I have one more thing. If Brunswick happens to watch this, get some therapy, man. You have some self-worth issues, I think, and you got to get it checked out. In conclusion, keep it real, all of you. Stick to the real discussion at hand. Don't let people red herring you and bring you into the butterflies off in the distance. Okay? Somebody did something wrong here, and you need to concentrate on that. All right? Talking about the conduct of the victims in this doesn't help anybody. Okay? Because ultimately, they weren't the ones who broke consent, and they weren't the ones who were sexually harassing somebody. Okay? Call it abuse where it arises. And for those of you who have decided to stick with the role-playing community despite all of this, keep making your stories and keep finding new groups, because there are plenty of groups out there who are more than willing to take you, and they are more than willing to give you a fair shot, and they will keep you safe. Okay? So, there you go. Now, where did I put my end button? Also, please, actually, one more thing. Don't send me mean messages on Discord or anything, because I will cry. Thanks.